I was 70 years old the day my only son pushed me away in front of 30 people. It was my birthday. My own birthday. The tables were set out on the lawn behind my house, the same lawn where he'd learned to walk, and there were paper lanterns strung between the 2 oak trees my husband planted the year Greg was born. I had waited all afternoon for that one moment. Just to hold him. Just to feel my boy's arms around me the way they used to be. So when he came across the grass, in his good shirt, I opened my arms and I stepped toward him, and I said his name the way I've said it 44 years. And he put his hands up, flat, in front of his chest, like a man stopping traffic. He stepped back so fast, he nearly knocked over a chair. And he said, loud enough that the music stopped mattering, loud enough that my sister set down her glass, "Don't. Just don't, Mom. God, do you always have to make everything into a scene?" The lawn went quiet. 30 faces turned toward me, and then, out of kindness, turned away, which was somehow worse. My arms were still half open. I remember the exact weight of them coming down to my sides. I remember the smell of the cut grass and the frosting on the cake nobody was going to eat now. And I remember thinking very clearly, very calmly, in the middle of all that shame, that my son had no idea what I had already done. 3 weeks earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday, I had sat in a quiet office across from a woman with kind eyes and a stack of documents, and I had taken out my husband's fountain pen, and I had signed my name 6 times. And with those 6 signatures, I had quietly, permanently, and completely changed the ground my son was standing on. He just didn't know it yet. He thought he was pushing away a foolish old woman. He was pushing away the only person in that yard who still held every card. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what I did, and why it was fair, you have to know how we got to that lawn. You have to go back. So let me take you back. My name is Eleanor. Everyone who loves me calls me Nell. My husband Harold called me Nell for 46 years. Right up until the morning 4 years ago when he squeezed my hand once in the hospital and then didn't squeeze it again. Harold taught high school history for 31 years. He was the kind of teacher whose students came back at Christmas, grown men and women with children of their own, just to sit at our kitchen table and tell him he'd changed their lives. He graded every paper by hand, in the evening, at that same table, with a plain black fountain pen his own father had given him. A worn, gold nib. He'd fill it from a little bottle of blue-black ink and grade until midnight. And when I'd tell him to come to bed, he'd say, "One more, Nell. This one's trying. That pen is going to matter later. I want you to remember it. I was not a woman who sat home all those years. I worked. For 32 years, I was a paralegal at an estate planning firm, Whitfield and Crane. 3 lawyers and me, and a coffee pot that never got cleaned. Wills, trusts, powers of attorney, probate. I drafted the documents. I sat with the grieving widows and the squabbling children. I watched, over 3 decades, exactly how families come apart over money, and exactly how the ones who plan ahead keep from coming apart at all. I typed 10,000 pages I never imagined I'd one day need for myself. Harold and I raised 2 children in that house. Greg came first. Then, 3 years later, our daughter Carol. Carol lives 4 states away now, married to a good, quiet man, raising a girl of her own, my granddaughter Beth, who is 19 and studying to be a nurse, and who has my mother's exact laugh. Carol never asked me for a thing in her life. She calls on Sundays. She sends me photographs of Beth. When I told her, much later, what her brother had done, she cried on the phone, but she was not surprised. She said, "Mom, I've been watching it happen for 2 years. But Greg." Oh, I have to be honest with you about Greg, because if I only tell you the bad, you won't believe the good, and then none of this will mean anything. Greg was a warm boy. He was the one who cried at sad movies. And here is the thing I cannot leave out. The thing that made all of it hurt the way it did. When Harold was dying, it was Greg who came. Every single weekend for 5 months, Greg drove the 2 hours out from the city on Friday night and drove back Sunday. And in between, he sat up with his father through the bad nights so I could sleep. I came downstairs once at 3 a.m. and saw my grown son sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand resting on his father's forehead, just holding it there, and saying, very softly, "I've got you, Dad. Go on and rest. I've got you." I stood in that doorway, and I thought, whatever else happens in this life, I raised a good man. I tell you that so you understand. This is not a story about a monster. This is a story about a good man who let something get its hooks into him, and about what his mother had to do about it. That's harder. The monsters are easy. It's the good ones going wrong that break your heart. And I want you to understand one more thing about me before we go on, because it turns out to be the hinge the whole story swings on. I was not a confused old woman. I need to be plain about that, because my son was about to spend a great deal of energy telling the world that I was. My mind has always been the sharpest tool I own. At that firm, I was the one the lawyers came to when they'd lost the thread of a file. I balanced my own checkbook to the penny. I did the crossword in Ink Harold's ink. There was nothing wrong with my memory, and nothing wrong with my judgment. What was wrong was only this: I loved my son, and love makes you slow to see the knife coming. That's a different thing entirely from being feeble. One of them is a weakness. The other is just a mother. Remember that. The something that got its hooks into Greg was money, or rather, the lack of it. About 2 years after Harold passed, Greg went into business with a friend, building, developing land, flipping houses, the kind of thing that looks like a fortune on a napkin and turns into a sinkhole the moment the interest rate moves. I didn't know the details then. I know them now. He'd taken a second mortgage on his own home. He'd borrowed against things he shouldn't have borrowed against. And somewhere in the middle of all that quiet drowning, he did the arithmetic that so many desperate children do. He looked out at his mother, a 70-year-old widow, alone, in a paid-off house on a nice piece of land, and instead of seeing his mother, he started to see an asset, a problem that could be solved, a number. I didn't feel it happen all at once. It came the way the cold comes in October, 1 degree at a time, until one morning you realize you're freezing, and you can't remember when you last felt warm. The first thing was the car. I'd had one small fender bender in the grocery store parking lot. Nobody hurt, a scraped bumper, the sort of thing that happens to drivers of every age. But Greg drove out that same week, and he sat me down at my own kitchen table, and he held out his hand and he said, "Mom, I think it's time. For everybody's safety." And I gave him my keys, because he said it gently, and because I was frightened, for just a moment, that maybe he was right. He took my independence out of my kitchen in his coat pocket, and I thanked him for it. I want you younger folks watching to hear that part clearly, because that is how it always starts. Not with cruelty, with concern. Concern is the coat they wear. The second thing came at Thanksgiving, and this is the one I still see when I close my eyes. I'd cooked all day. The whole family was there, and Greg's wife Dana, I should tell you about Dana. Dana is not a bad woman, but she is a frightened one. And frightened people do terrible arithmetic. It was Dana who kept the fear turning over in Greg's mind. I'm sure of it, because Greg never used to talk about equity and market value, and suddenly he talked of nothing else. Halfway through the meal, before the pie, Greg reached down beside his chair and brought up a folder, a legal folder, at the Thanksgiving table. He slid it across to me, right across the tablecloth, and it came to rest on the edge of my plate, and I watched a smear of gravy soak into the corner of the top page. He'd printed it out. A durable power of attorney. Naming himself. It just makes things simpler, Mom, he said. So I can help you with everything. Bills, the house, doctors. You don't want to be dealing with all that at your age. Now here is a small, quiet fact that Greg had forgotten, or maybe never fully understood. His mother spent 32 years drafting exactly these documents. I knew what a power of attorney does, and, more importantly, what it does not do. A power of attorney lets someone act for you. It does not let them act against you. I knew the difference between helping a person and taking a person. And I sat there with gravy on my son's paperwork, and I understood, with a cold that went all the way down, that my boy was not trying to help me carry the load. He was trying to get his hands on the wheel. I didn't sign it that day. I said I'd think about it. Dana and Greg exchanged a look across the turkey that I was not supposed to see, and I saw it, and something in me went very still and very awake. 30 years in that law office, and I knew that look. I'd seen it on the faces of children in my conference room 100 times, sitting across from a mother who'd gone soft in the mind, dividing her up before she was even gone. And running underneath those 2 moments, quiet as water moving under ice, there was something else I only pieced together fully later. Greg had begun, very carefully, to tell people I was slipping. Never to my face, to everyone else. He'd mentioned to my sister, in a low, concerned voice, that I'd seemed confused lately. He told a cousin I'd gotten turned around driving somewhere I'd driven for 40 years. None of it was true. But he said it the way a man plants seeds patiently, in a lot of small holes, knowing that one day he'll want a whole field of it to point at. I felt the sting of that once, and it was sharp, and it was public. It was a family cookout. High summer. I was telling a story about the day Beth was christened, and I got a date a little wrong, an ordinary slip. The kind every single one of you has made this week. And before I could even catch it myself, Greg stepped in, gently, in front of my own grandchildren, and he patted my hand and said, "It's okay, Mom. Don't worry about it. We know. We know." 2 words, and I watched the younger ones glance at each other, and I understood, standing there with a paper plate in my hand, that a story had already been written about me inside my own family. That I was being quietly recast, in front of the people I loved most, from the woman who ran a law office into some poor old thing who couldn't be trusted to remember a birthday. That was the sting I carried home that night. That was the one that told me, for certain, that this was not carelessness or worry. It was a campaign. And a campaign is a thing you can lose or a thing you can turn. The third thing was the one that finished it. That took me from hurt to certain. It was a few weeks before my birthday. I was in the back hallway of my own house, and Greg was in the kitchen, and he didn't know I'd come in from the garden. He was on the phone, and his voice had that bright, closing a deal tone I'd never once heard him use with me. And I heard him say, "No, it's a great lot, almost an acre, paid off free and clear. My mother's place. We'll list it in the spring, once we get everything squared away with her." And then he laughed at something the other person said, and he added the word that turned my blood to ice water. He didn't say if. He said, "It'll show great once we get her settled somewhere. When she's out. When she's out." I stood in my own hallway, in the house Harold carried me into as a bride, and I listened to my son sell it out from under me on the telephone, and plan the month he'd have me removed from it, the way you'd plan to clear out a storage unit. And I did not make a sound. I want you to notice that. I did not gasp. I did not confront him. I turned around, very quietly, and I walked back out into my garden, and I sat down on the bench Harold built, and I put my hands flat on my knees, and I made myself breathe. Because 32 years at Whitfield and Crane had taught me one thing above all others. The people who lose everything are the ones who react. The people who keep it are the ones who plan. And I had just decided, on that garden bench, that I was not going to be one of the widows I used to feel sorry for. But I hadn't broken yet. Not really. There's a difference between knowing a thing in your head and feeling it break in your chest. That came at the party. That came when he pushed me away on the lawn. So now we're back where we started, my 70th birthday, my arms coming down to my sides, 30 people looking away out of kindness. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it was not what you'd think. It was not rage. Rage would come later, cold and useful. In that moment, standing on the grass, what I felt was a kind of terrible clarity. I realized all at once that my son could no longer see me. Not really. When he looked at me, he no longer saw the woman who'd sat up with his fevers and sewn his costumes and cried at his wedding. He saw an obstacle standing between him and a piece of property. He'd pushed me away on the lawn because in his mind I was already gone, already settled somewhere. Already out, and the body still standing in his mother's yard was just an inconvenience that hadn't finished leaving. That was the realization. And realizing it is what finally broke me. I got through the rest of that party. I don't remember how. I know I cut the cake because someone put the knife in my hand. I know I smiled at my sister and told her I was fine. I know I stood at the door and thanked every single guest for coming, and I watched my son load leftovers into his car and drive away without saying he was sorry, because it had genuinely not occurred to him that he'd done anything that required an apology. And then, the last car pulled out of the drive, and the lanterns were still swaying between Harold's oak trees, and I went inside, and I shut the door, and I stood alone in my kitchen, in my good blue dress. And it was there, on the counter, that I saw it. Harold's fountain pen. I'd taken it out that morning to write place cards, in my husband's hand, in my husband's ink. It was lying there beside the empty cake plate. I picked it up. And that was when it came. Not loud. I didn't wail. I just stood at my kitchen counter, 70 years old, holding the pen my husband graded a lifetime of papers with. And I felt the tears come down my face and drip off my chin onto the counter. And I said out loud, to the empty house, to Harold, he doesn't see me anymore. Love, our boy doesn't see me. The nib was cold in my fingers. The house was cold. I was as alone as I have ever been in my life. And then, and I promise you this is true, I heard Harold's voice. Not really. I know he wasn't there. But I heard it the way you hear someone you've loved for half a century. And what he said was what he always said when a paper was trying and I wanted to quit. He said, "One more, Nell. This one's trying." So I wiped my face, and I capped the pen, and I went to bed, and in the morning I got up, and I stopped crying, and I started to work. Here is what most people never understand about a woman who spent her life in a lawyer's office. We are not loud. We do not threaten. We do not warn you. We simply, quietly, put the pieces where they need to go, and then we wait and let you walk into them yourself. The first thing I did was drive, because I'd quietly gotten a second set of keys cut months before. A small thing I'd done for no reason I could have named at the time, except that some old instinct told me not to be without them. I drove myself into town to see an estate lawyer, not one of my old firm. A new one, a younger woman named Miss Okafor, with kind eyes and no connection to my family at all. And I sat down, across from her, and I laid it all out. And then I told her what I wanted to do. Because here is the thing my son had completely forgotten, the fact that everything turned on. My house was not simply my house that would pass to my children, someday, in a will. Years earlier, back when I still worked at Whitfield and Crane, Harold and I had done what I'd spent my whole career telling other families to do. We had put our home and our land and our savings into a revocable living trust. Now I know that sounds like lawyer's fog, so let me say it the way Harold would have said it to a class of 16-year-olds. A revocable living trust is a box. You put your important things inside the box, your house, your land, and you hold the only key. And here is the whole heart of it. As long as I am alive, and as long as I am in my right mind, I can open that box and rearrange everything inside it, any time I please. I can decide who gets what. I can decide who gets nothing. And I can change my mind on a Tuesday and change it back on a Wednesday. And nobody on this earth can stop me. Revocable, it means exactly what it says. It can be revoked. By me. Whenever I choose. Greg thought that power of attorney he waved at me over the turkey was going to hand him the wheel, but a power of attorney does not let an agent reach into that box and rearrange it, not unless the trust itself specifically says he can. And mine said no such thing. I'd drafted 100 of them. I knew. He could have gotten me to sign that paper 1,000 times over, and it would not have given him 1 inch of authority over the one thing he actually wanted. He was trying to pick a lock on a door that wasn't even the door. So in Miss Okafor's office, over the course of that morning, I amended my trust. I'll tell you what I changed, but I want to do it slowly, the way it deserves, because each piece mattered. First, I removed Greg as the successor trustee, the person who would take control if I ever couldn't. He'd assumed that role was his by birthright. It was not his by anything. I named a professional trustee at the bank instead, a neutral party with no stake and no fear, and I named my daughter Carol beside them. Greg's hands came off the wheel entirely, and he didn't even know they'd ever been off it. Second, I changed where the house would go. My home and Harold's land and the 2 oak trees, I placed them, on my death and not 1 moment before, in a protected trust for Carol and for Beth. My granddaughter, the nursing student, will one day own the ground her great-grandfather planted those trees in. It will be held for her carefully so that no frightened husband or hungry deal can ever reach it. Greg's share of what I leave behind, I did not erase to nothing. I am not a cruel woman, and he is still my son. But I reduced it, and I fenced it, and I made sure that not $1 of it could ever be a house he could sell. Third, and this is the move I'm proudest of, this is the one that shows you I still knew my business. I did the thing I used to beg every client to do, and half of them never did. I protected the whole plan from the one attack I knew was coming, because I knew exactly what Greg and Dana would do the moment they found out. I knew it as surely as I know my own name. They would say I was confused. They would say I wasn't in my right mind. They'd already been laying that groundwork for a year, telling relatives I was slipping, telling people I couldn't be trusted with my own car. And a revocable trust only works, remember, as long as the person changing it is of sound mind. So they would try to argue that the day I signed, the old woman didn't know what she was doing. So I took their own weapon out of their hands before they ever raised it. That very same week, I went to my doctor, my own physician of 20 years, and I asked him to examine me, formally, and to put in writing, dated and signed, that on that date Eleanor Hartley was fully competent, sharp, and acting of her own free will under no one's influence. A clean bill of mental health, notarized, sitting in Miss Okafor's file, the exact letter I used to advise wealthy clients to get, and which so many of them were too proud to bother with. Do you see what I'd done? Greg had spent a year telling the world I was losing my mind, and by doing so, he'd handed me the map of exactly which wall to build. His own story became the trap he'd walk into. Then I revoked that durable power of attorney, formally, in writing, and I sent notice of the revocation to my bank and filed it where it needed filing, so that if he ever tried to wave a copy of it at anyone, it would be worth precisely nothing. I added what the folks at the Consumer Protection Bureau call a trusted contact to my accounts, my daughter Carol, so the bank would call her, not him, if anyone ever tried to move my money. And when every one of those papers was ready, Miss Okafor set them in front of me, and I reached into my handbag and I took out Harold's fountain pen. I filled it that morning from the same little bottle of blue-black ink. And I signed my name 6 times, and the nib wrote as smooth as the day his father gave it to him. 30 years of grading, and it never once skipped. Harold's pen, signing our home safe. I felt him standing behind my chair the whole time. I want to be honest with you about how that morning actually felt, because I don't want you thinking it felt like winning. It didn't. Every single signature was also a small grief. When I struck my son's name out as the one who'd take over for me someday, I was writing down, in my husband's blue-black ink, the plain fact that I could no longer trust my own child, and there is no clever legal move on God's earth that takes the ache out of that sentence. I sat in that quiet office, and I did the coldest, most careful work of my whole life, and I cried twice while I did it, and Miss Okafor, bless her, just slid the box of tissues across the desk without a word and let me carry on. Protecting yourself from your own son is not a victory. It is a wound you decide to survive. I decided to survive it. But I felt every stitch go in. I did all of that 3 weeks before my birthday. Before the lawn. Before the push. So when my son put his hands up and told me not to make a scene, the scene was already over. He just hadn't been told. Now, I could have called him that very night and told him what I'd done. I could have thrown it in his face. But I'd spent 32 years watching how these things play out, and I knew that a truth like this doesn't want to be shouted over a telephone. It wants to be delivered in person, quietly, at the exact moment a man is most certain he's already won. So I did the hardest thing of all. I waited. And I let him make his move first. I didn't have to wait long. 11 days after my birthday, on a Saturday morning, 3 cars pulled into my driveway. Greg's, Dana's, and a third I didn't recognize, a shiny sedan with a magnetic sign on the door for a real estate company. A man got out of it in a golf shirt with a tape measure clipped to his belt and a lockbox in his hand. A lockbox, the kind they hang on the door of a house that's for sale. They didn't knock. Exactly. Greg let himself in with his own key, calling out, "Mom, Mom, we need to have a family conversation," in that same bright deal closing voice. And they came into my living room, the 3 of them, and Dana was already looking at my walls the way you look at a room you're about to empty. And the realtor, his name was Mr. Pruitt, actually started pacing off the length of my living room, heel to toe, murmuring numbers. Greg sat me down. He sat me down, in my own chair, in my own house, and he took my hand and he put on his gentlest voice, the voice he'd used on his dying father, and he said, "Mom, we love you. And that's why we've made a decision. It's just too much for you out here alone. We've found a lovely place for you, a facility, real professionals, and Mr. Pruitt here is going to help us get the house listed so we can pay for it. He's just going to put the box on the door today. It's already handled. You don't have to worry about anything. All you have to do is trust me." And he squeezed my hand. And he smiled. He was so sure. He was so completely, warmly, fatally sure. And I let it sit for a moment. I looked at Dana, already measuring my walls. I looked at Mr. Pruitt with his lockbox. I looked at my son's certain face. And then I stood up out of my chair, and I said, "Greg, before Mr. Pruitt hangs anything on my door, there's something in the kitchen you all need to see." I walked into my kitchen, and I took a folder off the top of the refrigerator, where it had been sitting for 11 days, waiting, and I brought it back, and I set it on the coffee table, and I opened it. And I began, very calmly, to lay the pages out one at a time, the way I used to lay them out for clients across that old conference table. "This is my trust, Greg," I said. "You may not know what that is, so I'll explain it the way your father would have. This house isn't in my will. It's in a box, and I hold the key. And 3 weeks ago, before my birthday, before you pushed me away on that lawn, I opened the box, and I changed everything inside it. I laid down the next page. This says you are no longer the person who takes over if I can't manage. That's a bank and your sister now. Your hands were never on the wheel, son. But if they had been, they're off it. I laid down the next. This says this house, Harold's land, those trees out there will never come to you to sell. When I'm gone, and only then, it goes to Carol and to Beth, held safe, so that no deal and no debt can ever touch it. Beth is going to raise her children under your father's oak trees. Not a buyer. Beth, Dana had stopped looking at the walls. Greg's face had gone very still. I laid down the next page, and this was the one I set down slowest. And this, Greg, this is a letter from Dr. Hensley, dated the week I signed everything. It says, in his professional medical opinion, that I am of completely sound mind and acting of my own free will. You've spent a year telling everyone your mother was slipping. I'm sure you were planning to say it again, in a courtroom, when you found all this out. So I had it written down by a doctor that I'm not slipping at all. I never was. I just stopped telling you what I was thinking. And then I picked up the last page. The power of attorney. The one with the gravy stain still faint on the corner. Because I'd kept it, and I turned it around so he could read the words stamped across it. Revoked, I said. It was revoked before you ever printed a second copy. Whatever you told Mr. Pruitt you had the authority to do, you don't. You never did. That lockbox in his hand is going home in his car. Greg found his voice then, and he reached for the only card he had left. Mom, he said, and the deal closing warmth was cracking down the middle of it now. You're not thinking straight. You're upset. This isn't you. We can undo all of it. We'll get you looked at. We'll have someone evaluate you. And there it was. Right on cue. The very card I had known for weeks he would play. The one I had already, quietly, taken out of the deck. I didn't raise my voice. I just slid Dr. Hensley's letter an inch closer to him across the coffee table and said, Read the date, Greg. Read whose signature is under it. A doctor put it in writing that I am completely sound of mind, the same week I signed every one of these. You want to have me looked at? I already was. By a professional who has known me 20 years. And he does not agree with you. His hand stopped halfway to the paper. He didn't pick it up. He couldn't. Dana leaned in then, sharp and fast, the way she does when the ground moves under her, and she finally said the quiet part right out loud. This is our security, Eleanor, that equity was supposed to be ours. You cannot just hand a whole house to a teenager. And I turned and looked at her, and for the first time I understood her completely not as a villain, in a story, but as a frightened woman who had been quietly counting on my death to solve her life, and who had just watched the arithmetic come apart in her hands. It was never yours, Dana, I said, and I said it kindly, because I meant it kindly. It was Harold's. And now it will be Beth's. The only difference between you and my granddaughter is that Beth has never once, in her whole life, looked at me and seen a house. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock Harold wound every Sunday, still ticking on the mantel. Mr. Pruitt, to his credit, understood the situation faster than anyone. A realtor learns quickly what a voided listing looks like. He said, I think there's been a misunderstanding, and he clipped his tape measure back onto his belt, and he picked up his lockbox, and he let himself out. And I never saw him again. But before he'd gotten to his car, I heard him say to Greg on the porch, low and unhappy, something about the listing agreement Greg had already signed, and a commission that would be owed whether the house ever sold or not. Greg had been so eager to sell a house that wasn't his, that he'd signed himself onto the hook for a fee with nothing to show for it. His own hurry cost him. It usually does. I'd like to tell you Greg raged. He didn't. That's the part that still sits heavy in me. He looked down at those pages on my coffee table, the trust, the doctor's letter, the revocation, all of it in that steady blue-black ink, and I watched the certainty drain out of my son's face and something much younger take its place. For just a second, he wasn't 44. He was a boy who'd been caught, and who understood, finally and completely, that his mother had seen the whole thing coming and had quietly, lovingly, absolutely thought him. Dana spoke first, of course. She said, "Eleanor, you can't just Greg, do something." She said the word equity one more time, and I turned to her, and I was not unkind, but I was very clear. And I said, "Dana, there is a clause in this trust now that says if anyone challenges it in court and loses, they forfeit even the little they were left. Your husband still receives something from me because he is my son, and I love him. But there is nothing here for the two of you to fight over and win. I made sure of it. That's what I spent 32 years learning how to do." She didn't have an answer for that. Frightened people rarely do, once the thing they're frightened of has already happened. And Greg, my Greg, finally looked up from the papers and looked at me. Really looked at me, for the first time in maybe 2 years. And his eyes were wet, and he said, in a small voice, "You've been planning this since my birthday. You've been sitting on this the whole time." "Since before your birthday," I said. "And no, son, I wasn't planning to hurt you. I was planning to survive you. There's a difference, and one day when you're older you'll understand it. I gave you every chance to come to me as my child. You chose to come to me as a buyer. So I met you as one. I want to tell you what happened to everyone, because you deserve to know it didn't just end in a quiet room. Greg's building business failed that same year, the way it was always going to, with me or without me. But now he had to face it himself, with his own creditors and his own choices, instead of quietly liquidating his widowed mother to paper over the whole. It was the hardest year of his life. It was also, I believe, the year he finally started to become a man again. Because a man is what you're forced to be when there's no one left to strip for parts. He and Dana nearly came apart over it. Dana, who had done the frightened arithmetic that started all of this, got to live for the rest of her marriage with the knowledge that the whole scheme had been laid bare on my coffee table in front of a stranger with a lockbox, and that her mother-in-law had beaten her without ever once raising her voice. My daughter Carol flew out the next month, and she sat at my kitchen table, and we cried. And then we laughed. And then I showed her every page and explained exactly how it would all work when the day comes. Because that's the other thing I learned in 32 years. You don't leave the people you love guessing. Beth, my granddaughter, the girl who studies to heal people, she doesn't know yet the full weight of what's coming to her one day. She just knows her Grandma Nell is sharp as a tack and not to be trifled with. That's enough for now. And Greg. I have to tell you about Greg, because this isn't the story you might think. He came back. Not for a year and a half. And not easily, but one Sunday he pulled into my driveway alone, and he sat in his car for a long time, and then he came to my door with no folder, no papers, no golf shirt realtor, just my son. And he stood on my porch and he said, "Mom, I'm not here for anything. I'm sorry. I lost myself. I looked at you and I stopped seeing you. I'm so sorry." And I let him in, and I made coffee, and we started very slowly the long work of becoming a mother and a son again. We're not all the way back. Maybe we never will be. But we're closer than the lawn, and I've made a kind of peace with the whole of it. Not the easy kind, where you tell yourself it didn't really happen, or that he didn't really mean it. The other kind. The kind where you look the thing full in the face, your own son, Your own arms coming down at your sides on your own birthday, and you decide to keep the door open anyway, but you keep your hand near the lock. That is the peace of a woman my age. It is not soft, and it did not come cheap, but it is mine, and no one can slide it across a table and take it from me. Now here's what I want you to take from an old woman who saw it coming. The Department of Justice, in a single recent year, brought charges against more than 700 people who stole close to $700 million from more than 200,000 older Americans. And the federal regulators who track it will tell you that when you add up all of it, elder financial exploitation drains something in the range of tens of billions of dollars a year from people my age. But here is the number that matters most, the one they don't put on the posters. When the thief is a stranger, it's terrible, but when the thief is family, someone you know and trusted, the losses run even higher. It is so often not the man on the phone with the fake accent. It is so often the boy you raised, doing quiet arithmetic at your Thanksgiving table. Which brings me to the peaceful part, the part I want to leave you sitting in. It's a spring evening now. I'm at my own kitchen table, in my own house, the house that will belong to Beth someday, and to no buyer ever. The window's open, and I can hear the leaves in Harold's oak trees. Carol calls on Sundays. Greg is trying. And Harold's fountain pen is lying right here on the table. Where I can see it, cap on, its work done. It's blue-black ink safe in the bottle for whatever the next letter turns out to be. I earned every quiet evening in this house. I'm not going to apologize for keeping it. If there's one thing my 70 years taught me, it's this. The people who assume you've finally grown weak have simply forgotten that you spent an entire lifetime learning exactly where the strong places are. Let them assume. Then hand them the paper. So let me ask you, because I read every single answer, if it were your own child, if your own son put his hands up and pushed you away in front of everyone, would you have forgiven it quietly and hoped it passed? Or would you have done what I did and quietly put your house in a box he could never open? Tell me in the comments. And when you write, tell me how old you are, because I like to know who I'm talking to. I've got all evening. Before you go, sit with me one more minute, because there's another story I've been meaning to tell you, and it's been on my mind. There's a man I know named Walter. Walt spent 50 years working the same 40 acres of farmland his own father cleared by hand, one stone at a time. That land was Walt's whole life. And then, one gray morning last fall, a stranger knocked on Walt's door, holding a deed, a real, recorded, official deed that sold the entire farm out from under him. Every acre. Signed, it said, by Walter himself. Except Walt had never signed a thing in his life to sell that land. He'd never seen that paper before. That signature at the bottom, in his own careful hand, Walt never wrote it. Now, Walt is a quiet man. He didn't shout. He didn't grab the stranger by the collar. He went back inside, and he sat down at his kitchen table, and he opened an old cigar box he keeps in a drawer. And the next morning he drove into town, and he walked into a certain office, and he sat down across from the man who'd forged his name, and without a word he slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. But what was on that paper, and what happened to the man who thought he could steal a farm with a forged signature well? That's a story for next time. I'll be right here. Come find me.